The simplest insetting deal would be you sell a lower carbon product to a direct customer and it's bundled. They get the physical product and they get the emission reduction claim all in one package. And that does happen. We see deals like that. But more often, the kind of supply of emission reduction and the demand for that and the willingness to pay for that are disconnected, either geographically or maybe they're a few links away in the value chain. And so, mass balance, book and claim, these are chain of custody models that are different ways to do the unbundling. So, at the most basic level, these chain of custody models are different ways to think about how you unbundle the emission reduction from the physical product.
Well, welcome back to the Decarb Connect podcast. And I am really pleased to be here today with two people that have been not just clients, but also, I think, friends to Decarb, very good at giving us constructive and helpful feedback and very engaged in our membership. So welcome Emily Damon, who's Chief Growth Officer of ClimeCo, and David Prieto, who's the VP of Sustainability Advisory. Hello, Emily, and hello, David.
Hey, Alex. So good to be with you.
Thank you, Alex. Thrilled to be here as well.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be talking about a topic I don't think we have addressed it ever on the podcast, actually, which is to look at insetting specifically and how we can go about structuring the kinds of products that unlock value and really help drive the growth of green products markets. And I'm sure we're going to be addressing some of the many types of change that we're seeing in different marketplaces around decarbonisation and industrial CO2 right now. But the one thing I think everybody can agree on, energizing that green products market, getting things really moving, that's going to be the key to kind of a lot of the forward momentum. So I think really good timing to have this, and also interesting to have this slightly different angle of insetting. So before we dig into that, let me come to you and ask you just for this little bit of a personal introduction. So I'll come to you first, Emily. If you could give us a feel for both personally, how have you come to be doing this kind of work? Like, what's got you here to this moment in time? And then also, what is your focus at ClimeCo? And then David will come to you afterwards.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Alex. A little bit about me personally. I would say I'm an environmental engineer by training, and I really gravitated to that in school because it was a way to address challenges that I felt were really important, but apply numbers to them. So that to me was really satisfying to feel like there were tangible ways to have an impact. And have been working in climate strategy consulting for over 15 years now. Really, everything I've learned along this journey that I've had working with companies to understand their environmental impacts and have a more positive impact on the world. Everything that I've learned has really brought me to insetting. That's a solution that I believe will help us unlock decarbonization and accelerate a whole lot of decarbonization that the world needs. So my role at ClimeCo, I lead our insetting program, and as you said, Chief Growth Officer, work on some of our other initiatives such as international expansion, which definitely relates. But excited to talk today about insetting with you.
Great. Well, let me just ask you one question before I go to David. I'm always fascinated by how people go from their degree choice, if you like, into their career choice. So you talked about that interest in like the numbers and the applicability and the practicality linked to environmentalism. What was your first step? What was your first step out of uni for those listening, and how has that brought you to ClimeCo specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm one of those rare people who I still today in my daily work use equations that I learned in college, which is pretty special and rare. So my first step, I had an incredible professor in college, and he structured our senior design project to be as if to be set up as if we were consultants. So he was the client, and he had data, and we had to request it. He had a certain need, we had a budget, we had a certain number of hours that we could spend on the project. He really made us feel like we were consultants, and it was a great project. He was a great professor, and so yeah, I went straight into consulting after university, and here I am today, still using all those equations and understanding particulate matter, all that. It's a lot of fun.
Good. All right. Well, thank you for that. That's really good context, I think, for what you're going to be talking about next. And David, tell me the same kind of thing. What is it that brought little David Prieto through school into uni, out into the world, and onwards to this point where you're now leading the sustainability advisory group at ClimeCo?
Exactly. These questions are always a joy to go down memory lane. I would say in my background is in climate policy and sustainability management. So I came at this more from the bigger picture of looking at international negotiations and understanding what this big problem that being climate change and how, based on my skill sets, I could help, add my grain of sand to the solution. And I would say I've always approached it from a perspective of resilience and how, for example, the expansion of clean energy would empower all sorts of economies to be more independent. I think when I read a lot of history, you look at moments such as the 1970s oil crisis, where the U.S. rather was subject to a lot of pressure from foreign countries, and then the idea of not only providing cleaner air through renewable energy, but also independence from the sways of markets where you might not have influence felt very powerful. So that was kind of how I initially started getting involved with this. And then with time, I learned the value of and the joy I have working with very large companies who not only underpin capital markets that are within our pension funds, but also employ thousands of people and help people have careers to build families and all that. And that's something that I rely on when I advise very large companies how to reduce emissions. And even a 1% reduction can be very, very significant if it's a company that provides a service that, let's say, the majority of us use. And luckily for me, Emily and I have worked together for almost a decade now. And it's been a great ride so far. And Insetting, like her, I believe is an endpoint of a lot of what we've learned for more than a decade myself in the consulting space.
Okay. I think that's really interesting to have those two different, different types of brains tackling this issue. And just to kind of follow on from something you said there, David, I sometimes people ask me, even in my business, like, well, why focus on industrials? Why focus on these emitters? Why not, focus elsewhere on, I don't know, the people that are perceived to be doing more quickly? And the answer for me is kind of what you've said, which is incremental changes amongst the heaviest emitters in the world have such an outsized impact that it's all the much more worthwhile doing. And again, we'll come to insetting now, but I think that's why this is a kind of an interesting tool in the strategy of an industrial. So Emily, I'm going to lean into you then. Let's do a bit of scene setting on what is insetting.
Mhm.
Because I don't know, I mean, it wasn't something that I was familiar with as a phrase until about a year ago. And how is insetting and scope three, how is it performing in the kind of relative significance in decarbonisation discussions today?
Absolutely. Yeah. So first, what is insetting? The best place to start. Uh, the way we describe insetting is that it is a mechanism to provide a flow of dollars to decarbonization projects within a value chain. And the term insetting is coined based on kind of a sister product of offsetting, which offsets also provide a mechanism to bring dollars to decarbonization projects. But offsets are projects anywhere in the world, in any value chain. They aren't necessarily related to the company who's purchasing and retiring those offsets, who's, feeding the dollars into the reduction project. Insetting, on the other hand, is really designed to fit within the frameworks of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There are expectations around reducing emissions that are within your control, abatement in the terms of SBTI, and scope three as defined by Greenhouse Gas Protocol and SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, is expecting that or requires that most companies who set science based targets include a scope three reduction component to that. So insetting again is really just it's enabling emission reductions and creating these partnerships across the value chain where incentives are aligned.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do something which is nigh on impossible on an audio podcast, but have a go. if you were going to try and describe it, like imagine you have the audio version of a whiteboard, like how would someone coming to this for the first time understand it? So if let's say I'm a steel producer, what does this
Sure.
mean to me? What is it that I'm going to be doing to kind of kickstart my insetting process? And I know we're going to talk to David in a moment about the role they play in scope 3. So it's really just trying to give a visual idea of this to me as a steel producer.
Absolutely. Well, depends on how carbon intensive your steel is, Alex. But the idea with insetting is if you're able to produce a lower carbon version of your product or service, then there may be someone out there who's willing to pay for that. So, Alex, let's say you produce traditional steel in a traditional way, but then you are going to perhaps invest in maybe a new plant that is a much lower carbon production. When you're able to do that, you are reducing your scope one and or two emissions, likely your scope one emissions. Um, the rules of greenhouse gas protocol say that you as a supplier, you as a producer, you keep that claim for a scope one reduction based on your investment in decarbonization. The companies who buy your product can also be claiming a scope three reduction because their scope three is double counting by design per the rules of greenhouse gas protocol. So your customers are taking, they take their scope three emissions reflect your scope one emissions. And when you reduce scope one, they get to reduce scope three. And more companies have scope three emission reduction targets. And that really incentivizes them to look for suppliers like you making your lower carbon steel who can help them meet their goals. There's actually a public example that's in exactly this value chain. So Volvo, there are articles about a deal that Volvo struck with H2 Green Steel, and I think these articles came out in 2023 or 2024. But Volvo signed up to pay a premium for near zero emission steel being produced by H2 Green Steel, and I believe it's a multi-year offtake to help fund, bring again those dollars to the decarbonization efforts of H2 Green Steel.
Spot on. And I think really useful to have that example, the practical example that some of us have read about in the news, just to hang this on while we dig in a little bit more. So, David, I'm going to come to you. We have heard a little there about the role of insets in managing scope 3, but can you develop that a bit more and also speak to how the value of a carbon inset works?
Definitely. I think, the example Emily gave with Volvo is one that demonstrates what we call a bilateral agreement and a bundle delivery of the product, where Volvo agreed to purchase the tonnage of low carbon steel, but that steel was physically delivered to Volvo, and Volvo physically used that steel to manufacture their cars. Alternatively, there are two types of general contracts we've seen where, let's say, the production of that steel happened in Sweden, but the use of that steel, in terms of the claim, happened in the United States. There, the way to go would be to unbundle what we call the environmental attributes, so that the manufacturer in the United States can claim that they use low carbon steel. So that's one other contracting format that happens. And third is what we call multilateral deals, where there is the actual user of the particular commodity, there is the claimant of the scope 3, and then there's the financier. And an example there that we can come up with is a public example that was done with Infinium, which is an e-fuels manufacturer, American Airlines, and Citibank. So in this case, it's a very interesting example because Infinium is the producer of the e-fuel, which has a low carbon intensity compared to traditional jet fuel. And American Airlines, as an airline, is the one who purchased the fuel and used it to transport their passengers, and that is their scope 1. However, airlines have very, very tight margins as an industry, so their ability to take in that willingness to pay is very low. And that's where Citibank came in, who have a significant amount of emissions related to their business travel, which is in their scope 3, of which American Airlines provides that service. So that scope 3 reduction that Emily described is transferred to Citibank. So there's that scope 1 reduction and that scope 3 reduction. And in our experience, the willingness to pay is a function of the type of technology. So e-fuel is breakthrough technology. It's very, very nascent. There's just a handful of plants that manufacture it compared to what we call other feedstocks for sustainable aviation fuel. So that determines the value of the inset. And then a couple other key things are how the buyer determines additionality. Are they trying to commercialize breakthrough technologies? Are they trying to address feedstock constraints? How low can the carbon intensity be as well? And then how difficult, how high are the transaction costs? Because a bilateral deal with someone who's in your local market, the transaction costs would be less than when you have a multilateral deal with a lot of moving parties. So that is one of the things where right now we expect them to be, the value of them to be higher, but with time, as we all establish standard procedures on how to contract these deals, they should reduce in price with time.
Okay, so it's, as you're sort of talking that through, which sounds really nice and logical, that the thing that's also going on in the background of these discussions is how do we formalize this? How do we manage the risk around this, right? Because I feel like every time there's a step forward that industrials or others can make, there's then a reason why it can also, if not handled correctly, be a step back, i.e. in the messaging or in the communications or in the risk management around it. So how do we establish this? What needs to happen for this to be structured in a way? I don't know. Where's my question going? I guess I'm asking, how do we help companies approach this in a way that manages their risk properly?
Yeah, and for them to feel comfortable. It's a very common situation where Emily and I have been on, which companies come to us is like, why can't we just do this by ourselves? Well, there's brand reputation and also operational and financial risk, um, um, risk as well as it relates to these contracts. One thing to have in mind is if you think about the renewable energy credit market, which is what it's not nascent, it's established and mature. They have registries that you can book and claim these environmental attributes which underpin insets. So one thing to have in mind if you want to participate in these markets is what registries are out there that can enable you to claim the attribute for these new types of commodities such as steel, fertilizer, and whatnot. Then making sure that there's no double counting is one of the biggest risks. So if I'm going to spend to pay for a premium to be able to claim a scope 3 reduction, I have to feel very comfortable that the manufacturer of that attribute is not selling the exact same thing to someone else. And I think that's a role where decarbonization experts such as ClimeCo come in, because we help hedge that risk for both counterparts, not only from the claims aspect, but also from the greenhouse gas accounting aspect to make sure that, first of all, you're aligned not only to the voluntary systems and standards such as Greenhouse Gas Protocol and SBTi, which Emily described, but also jurisdictional requirements, because global companies operate in many different places, and there might be places where you might be required to, for example, purchase sustainable aviation fuel. So the role of instance, you have to be very careful what you can claim versus what you cannot claim when you're overlapping in what we call the compliance market. And last but not least, I'll also say, for example, certain materials have what we call environmental product declarations. So how does that relate to issuance of certificates? So there's a lot of moving parts that do definitely require subject matter expertise in carbon accounting and climate investment to make sure that, again, the people who are involved in the deal feel comfortable that they're getting what they're paying for and they're being able to generate value from that.
Yeah, I mean, because aside from the technical piece, there's also just a pure communications piece that they're also going to have to deal with, isn't there? You need to have that confidence that the contracts, the logic that underpins this whole exercise is something that is so reliable that when you communicate it and put it out into the public domain, it's solid. Because we've seen so many companies try different strategies, different tools as part of decarbonization that had the right intention, had the right goal, but somehow in the communication almost ended up creating a sort of question mark around it once it got out into the public domain. So to me, it is obviously about securing the correct approach so that you're you are claiming the inset that you deserve, but it's also knowing then that you can communicate confidently to your supply chain or the public about what you're achieving. So Emily, let me come back to you on that carbon accounting piece. We have heard a bit about it there, but tell us a bit more about that. So I guess we can see why you need that kind of expertise in the deal, but what is it that you're securing? What can someone with that expertise do for you? And I don't know if this is a good point to sort of ask a tag along question, but I guess I'm also interested in how do you track this kind of application of an inset from company to company at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Well, first on the accounting. So, as I'm sure it's clear, I think David and we've really enjoyed working together for a decade. I like the kind of nitty-gritty, the Excel spreadsheet, the equations that I learned in college. He's our big picture. We complement each other really well. He's got the market trends, what's shifting, keeping track tabs on all the players. But yeah, when you ask about accounting, I light up because there are a lot of fine details to keep track of. And so, when we've supported companies with insetting, we're there supporting both the seller, so the company reducing scope 1 or 2 emissions, and the buyer, the company who's looking to reduce scope 3. Or as David said, in a multilateral deal, we're holding hands with all parties to make sure that they have a very clear understanding of what what the quantification is. How does this affect all of the other calculations you're doing? Maybe it's your annual corporate inventory, maybe it's your reporting progress against a certain target, maybe it's your EPD, your environmental product declaration. We're there to hold hands with them to say, okay, here are the numbers that you need to plug into each of those things based on the emission reduction activity and your role in that. So kind of the quantification side is something we'll do, as well as then we layer on top of that the claims. There's specific nomenclature for how you talk about your role in these insetting deals. When is a reduction abatement? When is it a compensation? When is it a removal? We're there to really help companies make sure that they're using the right terminology so as not to get tripped up. And maybe, one quick tangent before we come back to tracking. um, you and David were just talking about kind of the credibility component. I think we saw, and David, you are better at tracking these things than I am, but I think we saw, was it Environmental Defense Fund that stuck its neck out recently in defense of Apple's carbon neutrality claims? Yeah, so that was a really cool, I think, moment because Alex, as you said, there's been this experience for many companies of feeling like they're getting into trouble for trying to decarbonize. And, yes, transparency is important. Yes, credible claims are critical. Yes, we want scrutiny. But that said, there's a point where it becomes too much, where goes too far, and where it makes even, the most leading sustainability companies almost paralyzed from action on decarbonization if they feel like no matter what they do and what they claim, they're going to get in trouble for it from someone. So to see an NGO come out in support of a company, in this case with Apple, it was on carbon offsets and carbon neutrality, but the intent is the same. This NGO was saying basically, we believe that Apple's commitment is credible and, back off stakeholders. Uh, this is something we've encouraged, as ClimeCo, we've suggested to SBTI, could they play a role perhaps in, looking at insetting deals, those companies who are progressing toward their scope 1 and 2 commitments or their scope 3 commitments through these insetting deals. Could SBTI come out and publicly, bless some of those deals or express support for, this counts. We believe this is credible. We hope stakeholders will give these folks a break and support this kind of activity scaling. So who knows where that will go, but love to see EDF taking that step. Just coming back, Alex, to your last question on tracking, I would say, there's a lot of technology underpinning to the work that we're doing. Some of the emission reduction projects that ClimeCo has helped invest in and implement, and we're now monetizing through insetting deals. Some of those projects require hourly data every day of the year. They're reducing million tons of CO2 every year. And so we've got a whole technology underpinning. There's an automatic data feed, there's tools that are scanning for outliers, for data discrepancies that flag when we need to go check the sensors. So there's a lot, I think, that technology can do to make sure that we are capturing the emission reduction correctly, and measuring it properly. There are also some deals that are more straightforward, that are a little bit simpler and that don't require, sensors and hourly data. But we've still tended to have a pretty careful tracking system, especially as we do more of the unbundling. So saying, Alex, back to you as the steel producer, if you want to sell your emission reductions just to David, because he's your one customer who's willing to pay, Alex, we would help you as the steel producer have a tracking system so you could be funneling those reductions to David, but then making sure you're reporting kind of a non-reduced emission intensity to all your other customers.
Okay. Well, I think that's really helpful because as you've both already mentioned, it's this sort of how do we make this just a solid strategy? It is a solid strategy, but something that people really find a reliable, consistent, bankable element, and knowing that what you're buying isn't also being sold elsewhere and isn't going to come back to bite you is a key part of that. But let me pick up on something else. David referenced earlier the kind of book and claim concept. Obviously, book and claim, also mass balance is something we hear a lot about from particularly our chemical producer members. And those are sort of models in this space. What if you were briefing one of your industrial clients on these, how or when you brief them on these sorts of models, how do you encourage them to think about it? Like, what's the mental model you encourage them to approach those kinds of tools with?
Yeah, good question, Alex. On this one, I would say the basics are exactly as David described, where there are the simplest insetting deal would be you sell a lower carbon product to a direct customer and it's bundled. They get the physical product and they get the emission reduction claim all in one package. And that does happen. We see deals like that. But more often, the kind of supply of emission reduction and the demand for that and the willingness to pay for that are disconnected, either geographically or maybe they're a few links away in the value chain. And so, mass balance, book and claim, these are chain of custody models that are different ways to do the unbundling. So, at the most basic level, these chain of custody models are different ways to think about how you unbundle the emission reduction from the physical product. Going one step deeper, there are some chain of custody models that have a bit more connectivity and others that have more flexibility and less connectedness. So mass balance would be, Alex, back to you being our steel producer, you're selling to David, you sell him physical product. And with mass balance, you could allocate more emission reduction to David than the physical product would necessarily come with. So you're shifting around the emission reduction, but you're still shifting it to someone who's actually buying your physical product. Book and claim, on the other hand, would be that's a chain of custody model with much more flexibility. And that would be maybe I'm not at all in your value chain, but I do buy steel from somebody, but I want low carbon steel. So you could sell the emission reduction to me, and that would use the book and claim chain of custody model. So it gets a little bit complicated quickly, but essentially, splitting apart the emission reduction from the physical product. And notably, the Science Based Targets Initiative, with their version 2 draft of the net zero standard, they, for the very first time, have said that these chain of custody models and this market-based accounting, umbrella term for these, market-based accounting is in play. And whether that remains in the version 2 of the net zero standard as it goes through its finalization process over the next 6 months to a year, that remains to be seen. But that is a huge step, and I think a huge positive step from the Science Based Targets Initiative that really enables the acceleration of decarbonization, because you can connect those separated, disparate points of emission reduction supply and demand.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Especially those kind of complex, as you say, the chain of custody models, I think can be a bit mind-bending when they're not your everyday work. But I think that was really helpful to distinguish the two. David, I'm going to pick up on the SBTI or as an organization and what they've been focused on in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you something, which is, I guess it is kind of almost the next thing down the value chain from chain of custody and that whole process of owning that inset, which is the registries for these kinds of products. So what is the state of play with that? And I don't know what, yeah, I'm always curious when you're in an early stage market like this, where you could have multiple entrants as registries coming in. Like what do you see emerging, and what's your sense of how that's going to develop?
Definitely, Alex. I think it's a very exciting time to be in this market because again, it's very nascent, but there's a lot of underpin standards that underpin the good work that's happened already in the past. I would say there has been industry-led registries and initiatives, as well as those that are led by nonprofits and those that are led just entirely by one company who owns them. So there's a bit of a wild west, and I do think, the role Emily and I have played with clients is to help navigate that and, pair the registry that fits the needs of the client and their potential buyers because there's no one size fits all. Granted, I will say that due to the low volumes that currently exist and the dramatic need of scaling that is required, there has been a pattern of emerging what we call buyers alliances, where you pool the demand for this low carbon commodities and then you reduce the transaction costs because you're sharing lessons learned. Um, that was done more than 10 years ago with clean energy, the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, which is now a very, very large organization of multiple sizes, from Fortune 100 to mid cap companies. And we've seen the next kind of wave of these environmental attributes is sustainable aviation fuel, or we have the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, SABA. And then ClimeCo is involved with an emerging one for low carbon cement, as well as low carbon plastics and chemicals. And there are new ones for sustainable steel as well. So buyers alliances that are trying to tackle what I think Bill Gates coined as the building blocks of society. And we view that as a growing need. And what ClimeCo is very interested in understanding from the organizations who are driving these efforts, which are very important, is like, what is the off ramp? Like, once the Amazons of the world have addressed this, how do you bring the rest of the market into the equation? So that's a very, very critical point, which I think ClimeCo plays a big role too, because we advise a lot of companies who are not necessarily the Fortune 50 or have big balance sheets like big tech, but still want to like demonstrate climate leadership. Um, and then that's just on buyers alliances for insets. There's also registries for carbon offsets, and they're also adapting to this wave of demand for being able to attribute reductions for your scope 3. And for example, Vera has an initiative on scope 3 reductions too. And even ClimeCo ourselves, like we've been engaged heavily in the offset market for more than 2 decades. And in that sense, we're also helping some of our project partners understand, well, can you have optionality? Can you sell an offset when necessary? And can you do the extra work to trace that emission reduction to a particular buyer who wants to understand if that emission reduction is within their value chain? So I'll pause there. There's a couple other standards that are relevant, but I'll pause there. Does that make sense, Alex?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's as you say, it's offsets have maybe created or some of the activities in the offset market in a way creates a driver for the inset market as it emerges to maybe sort of jump ahead in its sort of maturing, because I think there have been some well-noted issues, haven't there, in some of the offsets registries and so forth. And I think the key will be for insets to leapfrog over that and show that that's not just the nature of an early stage market, but something that they can deal with and get ahead of. So yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. So let's come back into SBTI then. So we've talked briefly about them. I mean, you'd have to have deliberately avoided all climate news for the last year not to have seen that SBTI has come under fire or been going through the mill and had to sort of change up some of their approaches. So how is that affecting this kind of part of your work? What are they now saying? What are they now supporting around scope three? And what's your view about the arguments that played out, but also just the kind of nature of the fire that they've been dealing with, I suppose, in the last year or so?
Definitely, Alex. I'll try to connect it to my previous comment on the buyers alliances. So there are the buyers alliances that I outlined are coordinated by the organization called the Center for Green Market Activation. So just by the name of it, they're trying to activate green markets for these commodities. A parallel partner organization, which is designed to help address the accounting claims that Emily described, is a advancing indirect mitigation platform, which is testing. Okay, once you spend the money, how does this work on a corporate accounting basis? Why do I bring those two organizations up? Because they directly relate to what SBTI is asking for feedback on. So SBTI, in terms of the kind of key takeaways that our team had on the net zero guidance, is they're increasing their flexibility for scope emissions. They are asking whether they should expand market-based accounting beyond scope 2, which is what we do right now with renewable energy credits. They're also asking how should they incentivize beyond value chain mitigation, BVCM in short, and underscoring the role removals play not only in the year 2050, but also in the year 2025 and 2030. So those are some key takeaways from the net zero guidance. And it relates to insetting on that scope 3 argument and market-based accounting argument, which is they don't use the word inset, I think, at all in the guidance, but what they call it is indirect mitigation instead. And pretty much they've asked for feedback from all of us in the industry, is like, how should we allow this to play out? Because at the end of the day, version 1 of the guidance had a bit of a blanket approach to scope 3 emissions, which oftentimes encompass the majority of the company's emissions. And what is the goal of SBTI? Like, Emily's been
Mm-hmm.
involved in discussing the theory of change of SBTI, and I'd love to hear more about that, Emily. But is the goal to have an accurate decarbonization target that isn't achievable, or is the goal to help commercialize breakthrough technologies that eventually would help achieve those targets down the line? So there's kind of a philosophical underpinning here. And the last curveball I'll send you, Alex, is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a separate NGO organization that is also reviewing their guidance. And their premise, their mission is slightly different to SBTI. Is like their premise is accurate greenhouse gas accounting. It's not commercializing breakthrough technologies that help us reduce emissions. So there's a bit of a debate on the value of both and the flexibility they should encourage. And to Emily's point, is like they should be able to give back-ins to companies who perhaps might not achieve a target, but are still demonstrating investments and things that could build these markets. So all those moving parts just demonstrate a very complicated dynamic of what should happen in the corporate sustainability space in the next 12 months that will probably underpin how this all grows.
The longer I work in this space and with industrials in particular, it feels like they're caught between what is, I think, most of the time well-intentioned climate lobbying and climate advocates, which I totally understand, but they're caught between that and then no one else is going to thank them if they go bust or lose, bin people. It's like just this crazy tension. And even in one particular toolkit like this, it plays out so much, this sort of tension that they're caught between. Is it better to be always right and perfectly on it, or is it better to reach for more? Is it right to only focus certain plants on certain activities, or does every plant have to do exactly the same thing? Emily, let me come back to you on SBTI though, because as David mentioned there, you are kind of focused in on another aspect of their work, which is around the corporate net zero standard. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, they've gone, the Science-Based Targets Initiative has gone through a heck of a year. They, started out last spring with with an announcement where I think the title of their blog post in roughly April of last year, 2024, was EACs, environmental attribute certificates, will now be permitted for use in scope 3. And the Science Based Targets Initiative's definition of EACs includes carbon offsets. So a lot of people read that blog post a year ago and said, wow, wonderful. We can now use carbon offsets to address scope 3. That really makes addressing this enormous challenge for us. We can see the path for how we would do that. We can start to estimate costs. We can build a timeline. So there were a lot of stakeholders who were enthusiastic, but within days, SBTI had taken down the blog post. There was a leaked letter from staff of Science Based Targets Initiative, who were very displeased with that. They rolled back this expectation that they had put out there about EACs and about especially offsets being the most controversial component. They took that back and said, we were just announcing that we are considering it and we need to go through all of our formal processes to update our standards. And um, so there was a bit of upheaval, which, as you said, Alex, you would have to have been deliberately avoiding the news to have not seen some of this. I know their CEO resigned last summer, and they announced then this formal process to revise their standards, which has resulted in now the draft of the net zero standard that we saw this spring. Um, so yeah, they've been undergoing their own tricky year.
Drama. Yeah.
Drama. Well said, yes. But I think this version two is really the net zero standard version two is really promising. I think it does give companies a lot more tools to address their emissions and connect with others who are incentivized to help them do so. So I do think that this draft does give companies more clarity and more confidence for proceeding with inset deals. And we've seen that really pick up. So a year ago, when this drama began with Science Based Targets Initiative, there were a handful of insetting deals out in the public eye. The Volvo deal that we mentioned earlier, for example, that was an early one. Um, as of now, something on the order of 50 to 100 insetting deals that are out there in the public domain. More happening behind closed doors. Some of the ones that we work on, for example, we can't speak of publicly, but it's still a number that you can count. And I would bet if we do another podcast with you in another year, Alex, it will be uncountable, or thousands of insetting deals would be my bet. And I think that growth is really driven by companies are seeing 2030 targets progress. Science-Based Targets Initiative has opened the door for more flexibility and clarity. So there's a lot that is lining up in a positive way. And actually, on that, maybe one last little nugget to add. I think another element that's really driving insetting is consumer willingness to pay. So, everyone voting with their pocketbooks. It really does have a positive effect and make insetting possible when a consumer looks at two bags of potato chips and says, wow, this one's sustainable, more sustainable in some way. I might pay a little bit extra for this bag of potato chips. Um, that kind of willingness to pay, we're seeing grow. So there's a couple of stats, a combination of McKinsey, Bain, and Deloitte studies. Um, Between the three of them, they have found that consumers are willing to pay more, wait longer, dispose of products differently because of sustainability. Another study found that this willingness to pay more is showing up in roughly a quarter of the total population. And when you look at just Gen Z and millennials, it's almost half of consumers who are willing to pay something more for a more sustainable product. And another study yet found that consumers are willing to pay something like an average of an 11% premium on a finished product for a greener product. So, put all those things together. Younger people are willing to pay more. That people generally in the population, there is a willingness to pay more. That willingness to pay might be something like a 10% premium on a finished product. you can invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a carbon capture and storage project at a fertilizer production facility, for example. And if you trace those emission reductions all the way down to a packet of potato chips, it might only be pennies extra for each bag of potato chips. And I think we're seeing that there is this consumer willingness to pay, and that kind of fuels the whole machine of this insetting flow, bringing the dollars to the decarbonization projects.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. We are certainly seeing or hearing about the sort of it's still early stages. It's not going to replace someone's main market share overnight, is it? But it is growing. And I would say the number of stories we've heard this year from our members, some of whom are finding those very specific parts of their extended value chain that touch into the consumer space. And that's where they're really focusing. That's where they're focusing their effort. They're not trying to create a low carbon product for every one of their buyers. They're trying to create a low carbon product that goes down this value chain. And a lot of the time, they're circumventing that value chain to begin with to get the agreement to then forge ahead with the project, which I think is really interesting signs of the determination to make it work in a time when bluntly you would think, if you again spent too much time reading the news like I do, that that industrials are looking for a way out somehow. They're not. They are trying to make this stuff work. Let's just come back again. So you mentioned at the beginning, you gave this great one-line description of insetting as this mechanism to provide the flow of dollars into decarbonisation projects within a value chain. Before we wrap up, can you give us a feel for like how do you go about this? I know you gave an example in answer to my question of, as if I was a US steel producer, but just if you were thinking about it, you can, use an anonymized project that walk us through who typically comes to you first, if anyone, or is it you going to people and suggesting? How do you piece that together and what are those key stages? And I'm sure this is something we could have dedicated an entire podcast to. So I guess what I'm looking for here is more the kind of how do we join the dots in that to help people understand what happens when you're piecing that together?
Absolutely. Yeah, maybe David, I could give an example of how we support sellers if you want to do a buyer support example. So we're who comes to us first, Alex, I think is a great question. And it depends. So in many cases, we are supporting companies who are looking to sell insets. And what I mean by that is they have a way to reduce their scope 1 or 2 emissions, and they want to find a way to monetize that to customers in their value chain. So our support in that case looks like let's, oftentimes we're helping invest in and implement the emission reduction project. Um, but then we'll do careful quantification of what kind of reductions are you achieving. And then we take that out and help them engage with their customers. And so we'll start with conversations with direct customers who they already have relationships with. And here's kind of a point of reality. There can be the most possible alignment between this company who's reducing emissions and this customer. They might have a scope 3 target validated with Science-Based Targets Initiative. You would think it's a match made in heaven. And even still, there's, sustainability team at the seller. There's then the sales team of the selling company. Then there's the procurement team on the buyer side, and then there's the sustainability team over here on the buyer side as well. So kind of 4 different parties. And the 2 sustainability teams, again, it may be a match made in heaven. I can offer you emission reductions. I'm trying to buy scope 3, let's work together. But often it gets a little bit broken down with the sales team and the procurement teams. And so ClimeCo, a big role that we play is we're in there really hands-on, helping educate the sellers, doing workshops with the sales team, preparing materials for them to put in front of their customers. So we're really trying to help enable an awareness. What are you selling? Why are you selling it? Who might want to buy it? How are you pricing it? All of those pieces we're equipping them with. And then when we find a buyer who is interested, and often that is the procurement team brings in their sustainability team on the buyer side, then ClimeCo is there to really help structure the terms. Okay, how long is this deal going to last? Is this a one-time purchase of emission reductions, or is this a 3-year offtake? We're helping with the pricing. We're helping, again, with the quantification and claims like we talked about earlier. So really just trying to help grease the wheels all along the way to make the emission reduction happen.
Okay. And David, do you have that example from the other side?
Yeah, Emily described it very, very well. On the buyer side, I think it always starts with the buyer's footprint, right? So a buyer will come to us and, hey, let's say our footprint is 100 metric tons of CO2e. And from this, we've identified three types of hotspots. One of them we know is the cement we purchase that represents 10%. So we have a need to reduce 10 metric tons of CO2e in our scope three. ClimeCo, do you know of suppliers that provide low carbon cement? And we're like, we definitely do. And that's always a starting point. Then in discussing with them, well, what's the budget? And then we kind of put together a portfolio of different types of projects because those projects do determine the reductions that you end up being able to claim to that 10%. So you might be able to purchase a volume of cement at using what, for example, let's call supplementary cementitious materials, which is a decarbonization strategy for cement manufacturers that might reduce it by, let's say, a third. So you've addressed 3 metric tons of that 10% you're meant to address. And that might be a bit more unaligned to your budgetary needs. Or you can get near zero, net zero cement because it has SEM plus the use of carbon capture and storage. Then the price of that is a lot larger, but by then, literally, you've addressed 90% of that 10. So you're pretty much left with 1 metric ton of CO2e. So we help negotiate those terms and also educate the supplier as well of that low carbon cement because oftentimes you're talking about very novel breakthrough technologies that are just coming online where the needs are very high. Like the dream is, please, I want to secure a long-term offtake deal for 10 years. It's what they did in clean energy, like a power purchase agreement. And oftentimes just the market isn't there. So there's a bit of helping manage expectations on both sides and also educating on the due diligence requirements from the buyer, which also are not always the same. We've come across buyers who it is a prerequisite to align with industry standards such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, the AIM platform versus others that are not. And that also underlines the transaction costs involved with it. And then sometimes we do work with technical experts with our partners, so they're able to answer some key engineering qualifications. But there's also a need to truly understand the carbon accounting side, which we're often almost always come into play. For example, what's the parasitic load of if you were to install CCS because you still have to power CCS? How is that powered? So we play that role. It's educational as well, and making sure that the supplier of the projects we work with fits into the due diligence requirements and are answering them accurately to the buyer in mind, and with the premise of establishing a long-term commercial partnership, but sometimes having to start on a pilot basis.
Okay. And out of interest, are you seeing patterns right now in terms of either the types of buyer or sellers, i.e. sectors that are coming to you, or is there a pattern forming in the types of contracts people are going for? Like Emily, you mentioned it might be a one-time or it might be a 3-year offtake. Like what are there patterns yet, or is it too early and it is what it is?
I would double down on what David just said, where we are seeing a lot of companies interested in pilot deals. So, there are, I would say, the industry that to us looks the most mature in terms of insetting deals would be the maritime shipping industry. There are a lot of deals there. There are a number that are long-term agreements for, maritime vessels that are using lower carbon fuels. And then companies whose products are shipped on those vessels, they're willing to pay a premium for that. So those kinds of insetting deals, there are quite a few in the public domain, and many of those are long-term agreements. But in other industries where insetting is a lot newer, we're still, like we talked about, you know, under 100 deals that are in the public domain. For industries who are just dipping their toe in the water, they do tend to like starting with a pilot. So let's do a one-time purchase. Let's work through all the steps of how do we account for this? How do we talk about it? Let's put it out to the world and see if anyone gets mad and criticizes this, let's adapt. So a lot of pilot deals and short-term arrangements for now.
Mhm. All right. Well, David, let me come back to you with a final question, then we'll sort of close out with both of your thoughts and hopes for the year ahead. But how does a market like this scale? Like, what are you expecting to see this year? What are you expecting to see perhaps by 3 or 5 years' time? Where is scale going to come from?
Definitely. I will say number one, insetting is already happening. That's, I think, a key message we want our audience to and listeners to understand. And it's not only happening behind closed doors, such as a lot of the transactions we do at ClimeCo, and the very big flashy deals are happening with bigger brands. It's happening on the palm of your hand. So if you live in New York City, you can order an Uber and you can choose whether it's a standard Uber, whether it's a hybrid Uber, whether it's an electric vehicle Uber. That is insetting in its own way. With certain airlines, they offer you to add a bit of a price premium to your ticket, perhaps of $5 to invest in a sustainability fuel fund. That is also insetting. And then if you go to a grocery store, I recently bought tinfoil that was manufactured 100% with recycled tinfoil. So I know the carbon intensity of that tinfoil is less. And in the house I own, I participate in the clean energy procurement program of my utility. That is also a version of insetting. So it's there. It's just we have to scale it, and that's where I think there's a call to action for all of your audience to work together to pilot these things, to share lessons learned, and to be able to create the market. Because by creating a market, we're creating a way to actually generate revenue and wealth. It's not a cost issue. It's a new business line that we think is very important. And I do think, in addition to piloting, it's important that they continue to engage these very critical standards. So Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, CDP. We are, the elephant in the room is the political landscape. It's not what it was 4 years ago. And it's important these organizations are very well intentioned. They have a very difficult job, but they have to listen to commercial realities. They have to be pragmatic. So I do think they have to hear from our clients that we work with so that they're able to really scale from only Amazon being able to do this to pretty much having everyone being able to do this. So we think those two things are critical. And I'm a hopeful person by nature. So I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't believe these were markets that are going to become a standard thing in the 2030s. Because at the end of the day, to claim that you're a company, you're in a state of net zero will require a combination of things. One of them is going to be these types of certificates. And I generally believe that between now and beginnings of 2030s, we have to get the standards correct. We have to pilot, share lessons learned, lobby for the appropriate or advocate for the appropriate policies to support the growth and the appropriate risk management associated with these instruments, these derivatives, so that it's just part of doing business, and there's going to be companies making good money off of it as a result of that, and it's innovation. That's how I see it.
So you're the optimist. Emily, I'm going to guess you're an optimist as well. But what's your kind of closeout thought on what you're expecting to see, what you're hoping to see?
Yeah, definitely an optimist, Alex. David and I share that. We're complementary in many ways, but on this one, we're very aligned. My closing thoughts, I I believe that insetting is really accelerating decarbonization. As David said, it's happening now. And I think there are a lot of positive tailwinds that are going to help it accelerate. There's the consumer willingness to pay, which really fuels the whole machine. And I think that is such a nice, inspiring message that each of us really can contribute to decarbonization by the choices that we make as a consumer. Um, and then there's corporate courage. We've seen a lot of companies, despite the, busy landscape, despite the evolution and the revisions that are ongoing with critical frameworks, there are companies who have the courage to take action, to invest in decarbonization. And I think that's going to carry us far.
David, do you want to have the closing word then?
I would say fully aligned with Emily, and we wouldn't be here if it wouldn't be for our clients and partners like Decarb Connect, who really do such a great job just bringing people together who are doing the hard work, who are in the boardrooms, on the plants, and trying to connect all the dots, because it is very difficult operating in value change, and it takes a town to do this well. So just really grateful also to you, Alex, and the partnership we have with Decarb Connect, because it's not easy, but it's worth it, and it's working.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for the thank you. And yes, it is worth it. Thank you both very much for that, because I think Insetting, much like any of the tools within someone's decarbonization toolkit, is something that can be hard initially to get your hands on when it's not sort of familiar everyday language. But I really think this podcast will have done a great job in kind of going through the key points and really helping people understand what lies ahead of them and the opportunity that they can be grabbing hold of. So thank you both very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. This has been fun.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. We hope you'll follow Decarb Connect on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard today and are interested in hearing more industrial decarbonisation stories, check out our membership network and events at decarbconnect.com. Join our network and we'll connect you to industrial leaders, tech disruptors, investors and collaborators, all dedicated to reducing industrial emissions.